And please let us know when we can begin.
Yeah, Akriti, I think it's time we should start.
Okay. Shivam, Khushi, please begin.
Okay, ma'am. A very good evening and a warm welcome to everyone. The Department of Journalism, Delhi College of Arts and Commerce, is honored to organize this interactive session with Mr. Jay Sai Deepak as a part of Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav celebrations of 75 years of Indian independence.
We would request everyone to kindly switch off their mics to avoid any kind of inconvenience and disturbance. Thank you so much. We would now like to request Ms. Akriti Kohli, our faculty member from the Department of Journalism, to please introduce our distinguished guest speaker to the audience.
Yeah, thanks, Shivam. I take great pleasure in introducing our guest for today, Mr. J. Sai Deepak. He is an engineer turned litigator from IIT Kharagpur who practices as an arguing counsel before the Supreme Court of India and the Delhi High Court. Civil commercial litigation, constitutional law, and competition law are some of his primary areas of practice. He's also argued some very prominent cases such as the Tata Sons versus the Greenpeace case, the Sabrimala temple case, the Sudarshan TV case, and also the Padmanabha Swami temple case, among many others. Uh, He's also the special counsel for the state government of Madhya Pradesh in the ongoing dispute seeking the inclusion of MP as part of the Basmati GI. Recently, his book, India, that is Bharat, Coloniality, Civilization, Constitution, has been published by Bloomsbury in 2021. We would like to extend a very warm welcome to Sai. I know he's having a very hectic touring across the country for book launches and speaking engagements. So thank you for taking out time. Sai, before we begin, just at the outset, I'd like to share with you that our students here have had some engagement with the post-colonial studies, especially,
Right,
for instance, Orientalism, in
right.
terms of how the West has looked at other civilizations with a skewed lens, and how that has also informed knowledge, history, perception. So they've not had a formal introduction to decolonialism or decoloniality.
Right.
And perhaps, in your interaction with them, it'll be helpful if you can briefly, sort of introduce the concept to frame the discussion. Yeah.
Sure. Sure.
So, yeah. So just, I mean, this is like a rider that they're very new to this field. So what I'll do is I'll hand it over to the students to steer the discussion ahead. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Thanks.
For some reason, I don't know if my camera is working, but is it okay if I just proceed with the audio? Is it okay?
Sure, sure. That's
Okay.
fine.
Okay.
No problem.
Because I think principles of natural justice only warrant a hearing, not exactly a seeing. So, so,
Well, that's true.
um, so what I've done, and this is not an attempt at self-edification. In hindsight, there are certain aspects of the book which perhaps could have received better elucidation or elaboration. So with that in mind, let me tell you what I've said in the book and what I ought to have included as part of the book. So what I've done, I think, in the first chapter is to introduce the four schools of thought, which is the modern school of thought, the postmodern school of thought, the post-colonial
Hmm.
school of thought, and the
Yeah.
decolonial school of thought.
Right.
And based on my limited understanding of it, as someone who's not trained in humanities, except let's say in the law, so to speak, I
Right.
have given as accurate as definitions as possible in consultation with experts on the subject. So
Right.
the one thing that was missing in that was an example. So let me use the example to drive the point home here. So assume for a moment that secularism as a value is celebrated as the contribution of European modernity. Okay.
Right.
And the modern school of thought takes the position that, first of all, this is the product of European Enlightenment, and second, that Europe is the only civilization which can lay claim to have been the father of this particular value, and that had it not been for European influence, secularism as a value wouldn't have been exported to the rest of the world and universalized it in the way we understand it today. Okay,
Right.
so that's the modern school of thought's position with respect to what we broadly understand as a Eurocentric framework. Okay, so it accepts that there is a value which has a European origin, and it also accepts the premise that what is good for Europe is good for the rest of the world. Therefore, the universal validity of that particular virtue, so to speak, is self-evident according to the modern school of thought. Okay,
Right.
the postmodern school of thought and the post-colonial school of thought, with a very clear caveat that I'm sure that your students perhaps understand the school of thought better than I do, clearly take the position that there is nothing European about these values. Okay, but they also take the position that while we certainly challenge Europe's paternity of these values, we certainly believe in the universal validity of these values, except that we don't want Europe to constantly chest thump about having invented it or having exported it for the good of the rest of the world. Okay. The difference between the postmodern school of thought and the post-colonial school of thought is perhaps in the realms in which they operate. One largely in the realm of art and culture, whereas the other in the realm of politics and society, outside of culture and art. So post-colonial school of thought, let's say, occupies itself largely on societal aspects and not necessarily cultural aspects. Okay. So whenever we discuss postmodernism, it largely seems to be in the realm of art. Now, the good part or the bad part about these definitions is that these are not codifications at the outset, but simply they capture the journey of each of these schools of thought. Therefore, it's an ex post facto codification of the journey. Okay. Now, the decolonial school of thought, in stark contrast to post-colonialism and hence postmodernism, takes the position that neither do I accept Europe's paternity, or even if I do, I certainly have a problem with the premise that each of these values is necessarily valid for the rest of the world. Okay. And as opposed to saying that all of this stems from a secular milestone or a supposedly secular milestone in Europe's history, namely Enlightenment, it says, I'm sorry, what you're actually exporting is secularized version of Christianity. Okay. And therefore, you start with the argument that let us understand what is the framework which has given birth to or which has spawned these values. And is it possible to really make the claim that each of these values has a fundamentally and militantly secular foundation as we understand the word secular today? Okay. So if post-colonial and postmodern school of thought can be reduced to the motto, break the rule, the decolonial school of thought takes the position, question the rule. Okay. And says, let's vivisect it and dissect it to see what are its origins. Now, post-colonialism, to a significant extent, shares its position with CRT, at least the critical race theory, to the extent that it identifies or it certainly acknowledges race consciousness and race supremacism of the colonizer. Okay. But there is a certain degree of reticence in understanding the biblical origins of that race consciousness. Okay. And it therefore stops at dissecting the race consciousness to say that, there is a difference between Gora and Kala, but beyond that, where does it come from? The concept of whiteness and blackness, what are its origins? That's something that is not tested or examined. And the decolonial school of thought says, why are we treating religion as, pardon the pun here, as the holy cow? Okay. So why don't we go a step further and ask if there is a direct relationship between the biblical framework and the verities as seen through the lens of the Bible and perceptions of whiteness and blackness. Okay. And therefore, if you look at the scholarship of decoloniality that emanates from Latin America and then has, let's say, there are certain counterparts in Bharat of colonial consciousness. What is known as coloniality in Latin America is known as colonial consciousness in Bharat. Clearly say, no, there is a direct relationship between the Christian consciousness of the European, his colonization project, and therefore it is impossible to separate colonization, evangelization, and enslavement of the rest of the world. They take that very clear position. Now, while there may be a chance that this offends sentiments here under the Indian Penal Code, the fact of the matter is that this is, let's say, this is the position of scholarship, established scholarship on the subject. Now, assume for a moment that the scholarship had emanated from Bharat. It's always possible to impute it with certain political motives. So, which is why what I have done is that I have said, you don't need to go about this in such a circumlocutory way. Here's what the scholarship from the international left says. Okay. Decoloniality, in fact, sees itself as part of the international left. Okay. To the extent that in their criticism of post-colonialism, they clearly say post-colonialism in countries like Bharat specifically and post-colonial societies like Bharat has had the effect of stifling local voices and privileging foreign experience of the local culture. Okay, which is to say, I'd rather understand Indian culture through an let's say a smooth air-conditioned perfumed mouthpiece which I have cultivated in Bharat. Okay, or I will spend a few months there, exoticize the entire place, call it a vibrant democracy, a chaotic place full of life and culture, celebrate the poverty here in the name of color and whatnot, take the worst possible pictures of Delhi ki gali and Kolkata ki gali, and then say this is Bharat. No, actually this is India. Okay, so therefore the exoticism and the esotericization of poverty that all of us are subjected to, which I don't think is actually right for people who live in those conditions, is also a significant product of this. Now, since you mentioned Orientalism, one of the things that I say, and I think I've said this in pages 162 to 166 of the book, where I specifically discuss the problem with post-coloniality in terms of Bharat, I've clearly taken the position that Said's position and his take on Orientalism treats Middle Eastern coloniality and Indic civilization as equal victims of European coloniality. Okay. And whereas I am saying, no, I am the victim who has actually suffered the consequence of your coloniality as well as European coloniality. Okay. And therefore, merely because post-coloniality seems to enjoy a very cozy relationship with the Palestinian cause and Palestinian connection, I don't need to, let's say, agree with every position that emanates from that school of thought. Okay. Because that school of thought seems to be fundamentally oblivious to its own coloniality with respect to other cultures which don't share origins.
Sayuti, can you please mute this person? Sayuti, you can also remove this person.
Can you remove him?
I apologize.
No,
We don't know
not
this
at all.
person.
Please, not at all. And I think it's much better because I think a judge of the Delhi High Court had to suffer a fan of Juhi Chawla when her petition was going on. Comparatively, mine is a better situation, so I'm fine with it. So, okay. and unfortunately, he was a Besura Tansen who was singing before the Delhi High Court. Okay, so at least this gentleman saved us the trouble of having to listen to him. So that's okay.
Yeah, Sayukti, please don't admit him or any unknown person, please.
Yes, sir.
So
Yeah.
this is the long answer to your short question, wherein I specifically also take the position that any attempt at building an alliance with the Palestinian school of post-colonialism could come to the detriment of our own history and our own legitimate concerns with respect to Middle Eastern coloniality. And therefore, there is a significant portion of the book where I compare and contrast the similarities and differences between Middle Eastern coloniality and European coloniality. So in terms of, let's say, what they believe are their scriptural origins, what they believe are their scripture-sanctioned racial obligations, there is a sense of ethno-religious supremacism, and there is a certain avowed anathema towards idol-worshipping indigenous communities across the world. And there is a projection of the contempt of their own pre-Islamic, pre-Christian identities onto the other communities. These are aspects that I've addressed. So one of the things that the decolonial school is also good from a Bharatiya perspective is that its metes and bounds or its contours are significantly open for us to fashion those definitions for ourselves. Okay. So the decolonial school says coloniality believes in applying a rigid definition across the world and universalizing it. Whereas we are saying, based on the cultural experience of each post-colonial society, They must be allowed to fashion what, according to them, is their own decolonial journey and identity, and leave it to them. So to a significant extent, there is room for contextualization, customization, localization, and which also means Bharat's current communities can sit and debate this. Why should you believe that decoloniality only leads to one particular goal? Why should it come at the exclusion of certain identities? Even that discussion is possible. Okay. So therefore, this discussion, first of all, requires an acknowledgement that there is a filter or a layer of European consciousness that most of us are affected by. And from there, where does this discussion go? Is a question that is typically left to subject matter experts on each subject. Since I can't claim to be an expert on everything, which most lawyers would like to do, I have typically said I have identified the existence of the problem across 4 or 5 areas. But when it comes to the analysis of the problem in further detail and perhaps offering tentative solutions, I will limit to my area of relative expertise, which is the constitution. Therefore, I'm saying, जिसको history पे बात करनी आप करते बैठो, जिसको बाकियों पे बात करनी आप करते बैठो, I will speak on the law.
Thanks, Sai. I think that was a very lucid overview of what to expect in our discussion ahead, and some of those points that you made very relevant. And I'm glad that you spoke about Orientalism in a way in which you're telling us that let's not uncritically take that theoretical concept and make it our own when there are issues there. So it's a great point. Okay, Shivam, Khushi, maybe just begin with your questions addressing sir, and he'll answer. Yeah.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. So, sir, starting off, you mentioned about the European colonial consciousness. So, what basically inspired you to write this book on this theme of, influence of European colonial consciousness on Bharat?
So, to each of these questions, I'll try to give very specific pegs from the book so that I'm not seen as saying something which is not in the book. Okay, and so that you can actually hold me down to the book and say, "Aapne ye kahan pe kaha hai, ye kyun nahi kaha?" You can always ask me that question. Okay, so I could have in the book directly proceeded to discuss the subject itself. Okay, without touching upon my own personal journey as far as these issues are concerned. So what I did, in order to make it more relatable, as someone who is, I'm not that too old, I'm almost your contemporary. So I've basically said, what has been my journey? Where have I encountered these questions? Either in my personal circles or in my professional space. Okay. In what form have I encountered it? And the one thing that I've been very clear about is that I have chosen consciously not to use the word left or right. Okay. Because I subscribe to neither. According to me, I belong to neither, because both are Eurocentric frameworks. Okay. Whether you call yourself right or left, you have imported these terms from the outside, and somehow you seem to be tied down by the history of these terms as opposed to drawing from your own culture. And consciously, I have said, therefore, even if you think you're right, you don't understand that there is a significant degree of the same consciousness that you draw from. Okay, I've mentioned this expressly in the introduction. Second, what I've done is that, and again, this is not an, let's say, an attempt at self-edification. Since 2016, when I started speaking on some of these issues, I've delivered close to about 250 to 300 lectures, both offline and online. Every time I've been asked so many questions that I felt that each of these questions has a common thought or a common train of thought which needs to be captured. That is one of the triggers. And second, in some of these matters of constitutional importance with civilizational import and significance, I felt that there was an invisible barrier that I was constantly encountering, wherein there was a certain perception, and there was, see, perception is easy to break, but a mindset or a psychology is difficult to overcome. And if that psychology or that consciousness is the product of deep-rooted training in education, or that is the product of, let's say, the society that you live in, which itself suffers from colonial consciousness, any amount of facts and logic that I present with respect to any practice is bound to meet with, let's say, white noise and zero response, simply because facts are not going to make an impact when there is a huge psychological barrier that exists. Okay. So every time I had a discussion on Sabarimala, standard go-to points would be, "Arey phir untouchability ka kya? Arey sati ka kya? Arey caste ka kya?" These are the standard questions. That effectively means you have an overall perception with respect to the civilization and this particular culture, which does not allow you to look at any particular issue on its own basis, on its own merits. Even when I try to explain to you, I am absolutely sure that it is possible for me to disagree with untouchability and still support the practice of Sabarimala. It's almost as if your mind is incapable of wrapping around that particular concept because you think untouchability and the practice in Sabarimala is the same. तो फिर ना मंदिर के significance को ना आप समझ पाए, nor have you understood the concept of a deity there, because the concept of a deity under Hindu theology is very different from the concept of God under Christian theology. They're two very different sources. Just because all of us are valuing in this particular notion that all religions are same, all values are same, all cultures are same, all roads lead to one, you're unable to understand how each of these practices and institutions function. So therefore, I said there is a master template that is needed, because there is a bigger issue that I'm trying to address, and that bigger issue is common to each of these aspects. Okay. Whether it comes to freedom of control, I mean, let's say temples from state control, or when it comes to, let's say, identity related issues, or when it comes to refugee issues such as the CAA, okay, there seemed to be let's say, an invisible barrier. And therefore, at some point, I said, I need to put this together. So I started reading up on this particular subject. I was exposed to the works of Dr. S.N. Balagangadhara, Jacob D. Rover, Sitaram Goel, and a host of other people who have written extensively on colonial consciousness in one way or the other, either with specific examples or in very lucid abstract terms, which is to say concept ye hai, theory ye hai, they had done. Then on 14th of April 2020, for the Indian American audience, I was asked to deliver a lecture on the Constitution, because the CA debate was raging even in America significantly. And Indian Americans were expected to justify or at least they were expected to explain the conduct of the Indian government. So they wanted to understand the Constitution and how the CA functioned within the four corners of the Constitution. After that particular session, the person who was the brain behind that session, Dr. Indu Vishwanathan, specifically urged me to look at the scholarship surrounding coloniality and decoloniality, basically saying what you practice and what you speak when you refer to these issues or when you represent these causes is what I would call decoloniality in action. And therefore, she said, it would help if you actually read up the literature, the scholarship on this particular subject, because you will have a better conceptual understanding of this issue. Because I had also, by that time, become very, very clear about the fact that I wanted to write a book on the relationship between civilization and constitution. So out of the three pillars in my book, which is coloniality, civilization, and constitution, the seriousness about writing a book on the first two pillars was already in my head. But I needed a critical pillar, which was the conceptual pillar. So once she introduced me to the concept of coloniality and also the literature, which she actively urged me, in fact, forced me to read, saying, you read this, it's important, you read this, it's important for you. I went through it in detail, and I had my gotcha moment there, which is to basically say that the framework explained exactly the problem that I was encountering in each of these places. And the best part is this framework resonated the views of colonial consciousness, which already had been created by Dr. Balagangadhara. Okay. So therefore, I said there are two sets of scholars, one in Latin America, one in Bharat. Both of them seem to be saying the same thing. Interestingly, neither is referring to the other's work. So clearly, they seem to have arrived at this particular formulation on their own. Then clearly it tells me that it seems like a real life experience, a lived experience that they're actually capturing in the form of a theory. So I decided to, let's say, craft the book in such a way that whenever we understand Bharat's colonization, हम इसको एक isolated experience के तौर पे देखते हैं. Okay, we always understand that history as India's history with colonization, as opposed to India's history with Europe's colonization of the world. Okay, because then you will be able to compare and contrast the same mindset which has applied itself in Africa, America, both Americas, Australia, Caribbean, and all these places, and then ask yourself, How can we then, in light of this experience, come to the conclusion that the Europeans' behavior with respect to the Indian communities would have been any different from his behavior with non-Indian communities in the rest of the world? Second, since the premise was that Indians suffer from colonial consciousness, I said, then I will use your colonial consciousness against you, which is to say, I will introduce to the scholarship of the white-skinned man because you seem to worship his complexion as well as his scholarship. Okay. So here's what he says. Now, if I had said the same thing, you'd have accused me of bigotry. Now, here's what he says. Okay. Now, let me see what is your response going to be. So that was the first section of the book. Then the second section of the book, I then juxtaposed the international section with the Indian scholarship to say, now, what is it that we Indians are saying which is very different from the international scholarship? We have been saying the same thing. So how is it that you apply two different standards, one for the so-called international scholarship and one for the Indian scholarship? Now, clearly, if you're applying two different standards, you're actually proving my point of colonial consciousness. Okay, because you're unable to reconcile the Indian version with the international version, and you seem to be much more open to the international version. It's proof of coloniality in action, according to me. So I said, that's how I will structure it. Then I said the third section of the book will talk about constitution, because the constitution is typically seen as the product of a national development. So I am saying, no, it is not. Constitutionalism, as we understand it, is the product of European colonization. And when I say as we understand it, it is to basically say we have had our own democratic structures in the past. But the current democratic structure that we have in Bharat, or at least its origins since the 1919-1920 period, is the product of colonization. And therefore, I wanted to connect it very specifically with landmark international developments such as the founding of the League of Nations, the Treaty of Versailles, the end of the First World War through the Paris Peace Conference, and how that was used to what they called was the creation of a Christian brotherhood or a Christian Senate. The League of Nations was, in their own language, meant to be a role model for the rest of the world, saying, this is how we Christians operate as a civilized society. And therefore, the rest of you are supposed to look at us and learn. And they say this as much in their own words. So that's how I structured this book and basically said, this way, when there exists a mountain of scholarship on each of these verticals, there is not a single book that puts all these verticals together and connects the dots and says, coloniality, this is the international development. Here is Bharat's experience with coloniality. And here's the constitution, which is the consequence of Bharat's experience with European coloniality. So it's like a telescope, broad to narrow to narrow.
Thank you. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Sir, we heard in one of your sessions that post-independence, India has followed a path of accommodation and not assimilation.
Right.
Could you please elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So assimilation requires you to blend in. Assimilation simply means, if you have seen the Pirates of Caribbean movies, you become a part of the ship. And your existence is invisible. Okay. That means you cannot be the odd man out. You don't have the option of being the odd man out. You're expected to blend in to that extent. Accommodation means retain what you believe are your unique practices. Chahe wo veshbhusha ho ya khan pan ho, you're allowed to do all of that, including religion. But Lakshman Rekha us jagah pe khinchi jayegi where your practices effectively are at loggerheads with others. Okay, especially if you happen to subscribe to a consciousness which is not native to this land, that is one fetter that will certainly apply to you under the head of public morality. Which is to say, please feel free to follow your religion and observe it to the best possible extent. But the red line will be drawn where it has the effect of interfering with my existence, or when it treats me fundamentally as someone who is less than a human being. Okay, or treats me as a second-class human being, forget a citizen. Okay, I'm happy to accept the status of a second-class citizen and a first-class human being. The other way around is not possible and not acceptable. Okay, so therefore the position is to basically say, this is where the red line is to be drawn. So accommodation basically says, please feel free to have your own communities and your own, let's say, spaces where you think you're comfortable living with those who share your values. In fact, I don't see that as something that is negative. You may have your own dietary restrictions. You may have your own festivals. you may have certain aspects which others may not share. So I don't. It's contrary to, let's say, the urban psyche. I don't see a problem with that. Okay, because even, let's say, even in the urban psyche, no matter how much we congratulate ourselves on our open-mindedness, we end up going to localities where we see a shared value. Otherwise, we wouldn't step into that locality. Okay, so the benchmarks of what are shared may change, but the expectation of a shared value remains the same everywhere. Okay, it may be education in some places, it may be religion in some places. So our urban mind may say, no, education is a better standard, religion is a bad standard. Who decides that? You leave it to people. Okay, so the point is, my point entirely about this discussion was, Bharat, since it follows accommodation, it is reflective of its civilizational spirit, because it does not have a nationalizing tendency where it expects every immigrant to then convert in one way or the other, overtly or covertly, to the religion or the culture of this land. Okay, so that, I said, is the spirit that Bharat has observed after 1947, because that's been precisely the spirit that has actually characterized this particular civilization as a civilization. And I cite extensive literature in that particular regard supporting each of these propositions.
Okay, sir. Sir, I wanted to ask you that as students of journalism, how can we liberate ourselves from the legacy of imperialism by the process of decoloniality in our practice?
You know, your fraternity is at the receiving end of a lot of flack currently. Okay, and my sympathies are with you, and I mean this in a very genuine way. Uh, Simply because I think it's a thankless task. No matter what you do, you're bound to be at the receiving end from one direction or the other. You'll always get the rough end of the stick. Okay, so then perhaps I would fall back on what the Vedic tradition calls the Swayam Tushti, which effectively means I will judge my conduct on the anvils of my conscience. Okay, because I can't seem to be satisfying everybody, and there is no, I mean, I can't please everyone. So I will have to follow my own conscience and my own zamir in that particular regard. Okay, so I don't know if this comes across as condescending. All I can perhaps say is that maybe try and avoid politically correct filters. Okay, and when you're presented with certain facts which leads you to a certain conclusion that is contrary to popular opinion or expected conclusions, have the guts to embrace those facts. Okay, and have the guts to embrace the conclusion that comes with those facts. Okay, failing which, I suspect you may be presenting data but not information. Okay, so this is perhaps something that I would certainly want you to consider. Since I don't come from your fraternity and I don't understand the real-time issues that you face as a fraternity, I'm making these as very tentative suggestions. I leave the rest entirely to your own discretion. Second is, please go easy on Bharat. You're very charitable to India, but extremely harsh towards Bharat. And these are not exactly the same entities. Maybe try to read much more about the history. I think if history as a subject is meant to be made compulsory to any stream, I'd say lawyers and journalists must have it first. Okay, because both our professions suffer from a degree of colonial consciousness which perhaps no other fraternity suffers from. And I say so knowing fully well that this may not be acceptable to people from my fraternity, but I've said as much. So because we are forced to speak in a language which is not exactly native, and for us to be accepted in certain circles, the language and everything else needs to come to a certain standard. It needs to be chic and it needs to be, let's call it, Latvians. So therefore, my suggestion would be, try to be native if your intention is to be original. I honestly believe that originality comes from your own roots. Whatever you believe your roots are, that's a question that you have to ask and answer. Second is, I certainly don't suffer from the same degree of naivete that I suffered from maybe a decade ago, where I believe that certain portals are sacrosanct. I don't think there is any portal that is neutral. I don't think there's any profession that is neutral. All of us have our own biases. All of us have our own affiliations. It's a question of how open we are about those affiliations and how openly we acknowledge those affiliations to ourselves in the first place. Public ko baad mein chhod dete hain. First of all, are we open to ourselves? So maybe these are the three tentative suggestions. And even if you choose to be a journalist in English, please learn an Indian language proficiently. Extremely important. Whatever that Indian language may be. I'm consciously avoiding the recommendation of Hindi. I'm saying I leave that to you entirely. Okay. Because I'll be accused of being let's say a thoroughbred Delhi guy, notwithstanding my complexion and roots. So I'll simply say I'll leave that decision to you, but please learn an Indian language. You must be at the very least equally proficient in two languages, because that keeps you connected to the roots. And that way, I think the tone in which the same statement is made in Hindi may not be the same tone or let's say tenor in which it's understood in English. एक लैंग्वेज में आपको एक मुहावरा लग सकता है, दूसरी लैंग्वेज में वो गाली लग सकता है. You don't know. Okay. So do justice to the language, its tone, and its own culture. So decoloniality fundamentally says try to understand a culture on its own terms and then apply your own vivek to it, whether you agree with it or not. First, you understand it for what it is without any value addition. Okay. अच्छा है बुरा है ये बाद में देखा जाएगा, पहले क्या है ये समझिए, उसके बाद आप अपने वैल्यू एडिशंस उस पे डालते रहिए, that you agree with it or you disagree with it. Okay. So the first goal is to simply understand a process, a phenomenon, or a society, or a societal structure, or a construct for what it is. Let's just understand it for what it is, keeping aside all our biases, and then apply our frameworks to it to say, no, I don't think आज के डेट में ये चलेगा या चल सकता है. ये सवाल बाद में कीजिए. But if you start with that first, according to me, you're placing the cart before the horse.
I certainly agree with you, sir. Like, you should know a native language first. Only then you can understand your coloniality much more, and you can get into decoloniality then.
Right.
So, sir, that takes me towards my next question. Sir, do you feel that the Washington Post, the New York Times, the BBC, and others continue to see India and events in India from a colonial lens and infantilize us? Like, does mainstream Indian media uncritically echo what they say?
So if I were to extend the premise of my book, I would say, how do I care what they say? Okay. My first question would be, if an opinion about, let's say, an American issue in the Hindu or any leading newspaper is irrelevant to an American audience, okay, why on earth do we give them so much importance? You might say, no, because it's international media. What international media? How come American media is international media? I really don't understand that. One of the things that I also address is the meaning of international. So international law is internationalization of European law. Similarly, international media is internationalization of provincial media of one particular country. Second, I'm not someone who advocates isolationism. I'm not going to say don't be uncritical. I'm certainly not going to say don't look at yourself honestly and introspect. None of these positions are ever going to come from me. But I certainly cannot be dismissive of the colonial consciousness that pervades in these institutions. ठीक है, you need the constant stick to beat भारत with. आप सती के बारे में बात करते रहिए, जाति के बारे में बात करते रहिए, cow slaughter के बारे में बात करते रहिए. But even when it comes to ISRO and science, if this is your approach, then I must necessarily come to the conclusion that you have not given up the hubris and the arrogance of being the successor of the colonizer. And the Westerner, according to me, is the patra or the prapatra of the colonizer, or direct putra, why even prapatra. So I'm basically making the statement that whatever they say, perhaps you accept it not with a pinch of salt, but with a bag of salt. But before you go to all of these so-called international names, why would I look at them and blame? Because ultimately that is what I expect from them. What I certainly have an issue with is Indian publications acting as mouthpieces for these international sentinels without standing up for the country. And I dare say this, I don't think any job definition fundamentally requires you to be anti-establishment for the sake of it. Criticize the establishment where you think the establishment needs to be held by the scruff of its collar on matters of policy, on matters of law, on matters of conduct. 100% do that. But this nonsense that is, let's say, that's pervade outside, that the job of anyone is to fundamentally be anti-establishment. No, I don't think so. Sometimes I think it's there is no harm in supporting the establishment on an issue-to-issue basis. There should always be a problem with slavish support to any establishment, whatever it may be. But to assume that if you were to support the establishment on any matter of policy or principle, you automatically get branded as the stooge of that particular establishment, I'm sorry, फिर election किस बात का? फिर किस बात के लिए आप इन लोगों को elect कर रहे हैं? Then what is the meaning of popular will? What is the meaning of this purpose? I mean, this entire process. You can't say that the very purpose of this entire process is to create this mega punching bag where all of us keep punching at it and keep spitting at it. That can't be the meaning of democracy. Anti-establishment cannot be the traditional slant of any profession. I'm sorry to say this. That can only be the role of the opposition. But even a principled opposition typically is expected to agree with the government on certain critical issues, whichever that opposition may be. So when even a principled opposition is expected to find a common ground with the treasury bench, so to speak, I don't see which other profession can actually say my default mode is an anti-establishment mode. ऐसे थोड़ी हो सकता है. Then when, let's say, international media starts coming after any establishment, regardless of, let's say, the party or the dispensation or the ideological let's say proclivities of anyone in power, then don't we have a national duty even as journalists to basically defend the country? Or is national duty something that is exempt for this particular fraternity? That can't be the argument. And perhaps I think we should draw a line between introspection and self-flagellation. Okay. Introspect karna ek cheez hota hai, but to actually derive some kind of masochistic pleasure out of constantly flagellating yourself is proof of serious requirement of professional help. Okay. I don't think that's the way to go about it. Some semblance of balance between introspection and self-flagellation is something that is missing, which is why it has led to massive large-scale cynicism with journalism as a profession. Saying har cheez pe aapko you have to say something negative, and especially when it happens to be a certain dispensation that you don't agree with. Then where is the question of, let's say, neutrality? Where is the question of impartiality? Where is the question of finding a degree of balance where you say, I may have fundamental disagreements with an establishment because of its ideological proclivities, but I'm sure I can find it in myself to be reasonable enough to agree on certain aspects on matters of policy and principle. And some place आपको ये decide कर लेना चाहिए कि ये भारत के लिए है या भारत के खिलाफ है. ये decision आपको ले लेना चाहिए on matters of important, let's say, national security. I'm not saying therefore let national security be the all-encompassing, let's say, justification under which everything is justified. Nahin. Even there, I'm saying your criticism will be taken seriously only when you know when to appreciate when something is right. Your appreciation will be taken seriously only when you criticize when something which is worthy of criticism is criticized. It works both ways. If you constantly do chamchabazi and jalrabazi, then there is no point of your appreciation. And if you're constantly in an anti-establishment mode, then clearly there is nothing that anybody can do which pleases you. Because you hate that person or there is a prejudice against a particular establishment. उस रोग का तो कोई निवारण नहीं है. Okay, next.
Yeah, sir. Sir, so my next question would be, why is Bharat relegated to the margins when Article 1 of our Constitution actually says that India, that is Bharat?
So I'll tell you why this title came about. And I think I've said this in a couple of places because I've received feedback. अरे इतनी decoloniality है तो भारत that is India क्यों नहीं कहा आपने? Okay. And why is civilization between coloniality and constitution? You should have said civilization, coloniality and constitution. I've heard these questions. Okay. So there is a context and the introduction actually explains this very clearly. जब ये CA के दंगे चल रहे थे दिल्ली में, on a Twitter conversation, I basically referred to India as Bharat. An Indian master's student studying in America accused me of bigotry for using Bharat to refer to India. And said, this is Hindu majoritarianism. ऐसे भाषणबाजी शुरू हो गई, तुम रुक जाओ, मैं बताता हूँ अभी होता क्या है. Because he called himself a constitutional patriot. I said, okay, if you're a constitutional patriot, then this is what Article 1 of the Constitution says. India, that is Bharat. ये पढ़ा है कि नहीं? Immediately he deleted his tweet and blocked me on Twitter. अरे if you have such arrogant confidence where you are able to hold forth your opinions, सुन तो लो वकील से कि कानून क्या कहता है, उसके बाद बात करते हैं. Have the humility to at least accept your let's say your flaws or the fact that you're wrong. This, according to me, I'm sorry to use the phrase, the much maligned phrase, this is wokeism. Okay, मतलब opinions तो भर भर के हैं, लेकिन knowledge रत्ती भर का नहीं है. And that too factual knowledge. Internet के age पे, if you don't know what Article 1 of the Constitution says, then shame on you, man. Then you shouldn't even be talking about the particular subject. And the golden principle is, जिस subject पे आपका ज्ञान नहीं है, वहां पे मुंह बंद रखिए और दूसरों को सुनिए. That's the basic principle. I will keep my mouth shut if I were to attend a class on journalism. I will listen. I will have questions, but I will listen. But today, there is a clear conflation between opinions and questions. Second, therefore, the trigger was, पहले सुन तो लो कि आर्टिकल 1 यही कहता है. ओके, तो अगर आपके हिसाब से मैं बिगड़ेड हूं, तो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन का आप क्या मूल्यांकन करेंगे, आप करते बैठिए. ओके, according to me, according to you, views of Bharat is bigoted. Well, okay, thank you. It's a bigoted constitution. I'm very happy you just said that. Okay. Second, the point was to bring back the literal and figurative or metaphorical use of Bharat back into public discourse. India, India, India. You keep saying that, you would then forget that there is a very important branch of study called colonial linguistics or colonial semantics. हर शब्द का अपना एक हिस्ट्री होता है, चाहे वो मॉडर्निटी हो, रैशनैलिटी हो, रीजन हो, फ्रीडम हो, कॉन्शियंस हो, लिबरलिटी हो, न्यूट्रलिटी हो, everything has a specific let's say connotation, and especially it has acquired a certain historical connotation in the last 500 years of European colonization. And there is enough scholarship on this, mountains of scholarship. What I've actually disclosed or highlighted is barely the tip of the iceberg. Okay, I've used this book to primarily place in front of all these people, these are the sources. Throw my book in the dustbin and go and at least read these sources. If you believe that my book is full of propaganda, you can throw the book. I have no issues. And I've also said this, I'm absolutely sure people can disagree with the conclusions that I've presented, but I dare you to challenge me on facts and the sources. You will not be able to, because I've trained, in the sense I have donned the mantle of a lawyer when I did that I'm presenting evidence which cannot be refuted. First-hand evidence or scholarly evidence which cannot be refuted for every proposition that I put forth in the book. So the idea was to say, Bharat today has been relegated to the margins and India survives at the expense of Bharat. Okay. And the nexus between India and Bharat, which the objectives resolution of the Constituent Assembly was more than happy to recognize, and which the Constituent Assembly debate surrounding the naming of this country on Article 1 on September 17th and 18th, 1949, you should go through the discussions. All those sources which are maligned as Hindu sources have been referred to as the sources for the naming of Bharat as Bharat. Every Puran and every Itihas has been referred to by all the framers of the Constitution, and it was voted in majority. Very few people had a problem with calling this country Bharat. Regardless of their religious affiliation, they clearly understood this is the source, this is the stotra, this is the, let's say, the Gangotri from which this particular identity comes. Nobody had a disagreement there. How far we have traveled from there, where an Indian student believes that the use of Bharat is bigotry, is proof of coloniality, is proof of colonial consciousness, which your education system and language policies have furthered brilliantly. And therefore, I've covered that कि ये लैंग्वेज पॉलिसी और एजुकेशन पॉलिसी का ऑरिजिन कहां से है, भारत में अंग्रेजी एजुकेशन कैसे आया, व्हाट वाज द डिबेट दैट वेंट ऑन अराउंड दैट पीरियड between the Anglicists and the Orientalists, two schools of thought who were fighting around that period. All of that has been captured. So the idea was to say that civilization as a construct is stuck between a rock and a hard place, namely coloniality and the Constitution. That is why it's coloniality, civilization, and the Constitution, that it is sandwiched between these two constructs. Okay, एक जगह पे आपसे बोला जा रहा है that you're not worth looking at because you're not modern, you're orthodox, and the other says because you're not modern and orthodox, we will use the Constitution to constantly reform you. That you are a project, you need a constant intervention, as if you're a drug addict or an alcoholic. Okay, therefore we will use the Constitution as the instrumentality of reforming you, क्योंकि आप fundamentally आप विकृत हैं, आप deformed हैं, आपको तो ठीक करना पड़ेगा, इसका ठेका हमने ले रखा है. ओके, और इसका माध्यम या जरिया है कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन. सो hence coloniality, civilization and constitution. I hope I've answered the question. Next. 10 more minutes. After that I have to rush to the airport.
Yeah. So I think, Sai, what we'll do is we'll open it for two very brief questions, because I know you have to a flight to catch.
Yeah.
So Khushi, Shivam, just open the floor for questions. We'll limit it to two, and then we'll wrap it up. Yeah.
We would now like to open the floor for some questions. You can either open your mic and ask the question, or you can type it in the chat box.
Okay, sorry, I'll just moderate this. Rohit, I've seen your question. I believe you're asking for sources, right? To point you towards this. Maybe you can get in touch with Sai or Twitter or elsewhere. If you have any more, a more pointed question, then, or maybe others can, put in their questions in the meanwhile.
Rohit, you should perhaps read Dr. Nandita Krishna's work
Thank you,
on.
Krishna. Yeah.
Her book is extremely important, or even Vandana Shiva for that matter. While people see her in the mold of an activist, I would say she's a scholar activist. So certainly read both their works. It's interesting that the environment space is typically occupied by women, and I would like to understand what is it about men that they don't seem to want to operate in the environment space. There's another organization in Bangalore which is doing fantastic work on sustainability. It's called Buzz on Earth, run by Gayatri Chauhan. And there's a fourth organization run by Aishwarya Hariharan, again a lady, Conscious Bengaluru, where she is focusing on urban planning, drawing from Indic heritage and let's say Indic values of sustainability and let's say blending with nature as opposed to destroying nature. These are certain people that you can let's say discuss with. The first two are established scholars, and the other two, according to me, are policy wonks as well as people who are applying these thoughts on the ground.
We have another question, Sai. There's a student who's asking, how can the freedom of press contribute towards nation building?
Maybe first start with toning down the sensationalism a bit. Go back to the basics in terms of respecting facts and trying to see. There are two aspects. One is to maintain a tone of balance, but recognizing that not every issue necessarily has two sides to it. That is equally important. So this forced injection of symmetry and balance, that ये monkey balancing करना, अगर इनको गाली दिया है तो इनको भी बोलना पड़ेगा, वरना लोग बुरा मान जाएंगे, वरना ये लगेगा कि आपका कोई religious slant है या फिर आप secularism के खिलाफ जा रहे हैं. These are extraneous considerations. See, I'm sure these are very idealistic positions. I'm simply saying these are your goalposts. Try to go as close to them as possible, and hopefully we'll have a better version of the press. Because when you're reporting a particular issue, when you know for a fact that one party is clearly in the wrong, then please don't try to monkey balance that particular issue by trying to invent a wrong on the other side. Okay, so your commitment to facts and your ability to think of sensationalism as your enemy, these are two aspects which I think would significantly go in the way of let's say will support an informed debate or an informed readership. That I think is a significant contribution of a brick to the edifice of nation building. As media, this is all I think is expected of the media. At the very least, these are basic expectations. Any other questions?
Yes, I think there is someone who's asking about why is the government not reclaiming Indic values?
Because one, I think, in fact, that's exactly why the introduction of the book is so relevant, where I say that governments आती जाती रहेंगी, लेकिन सोचने की जो प्रणाली है या जो mindset है वो बदली नहीं है पूरी तरह से on critical issues. So tokenism बहुत कुछ हो सकता है, symbolism बहुत कुछ हो सकता है, but when it comes to actually giving a very clear institutional shape to reclamation of Indic cultural agency, I haven't seen too much. Perhaps the only step that I can credit the government with in this regard is the national education policy, which is perhaps a decent step forward. Even there are significant criticisms, but I do believe that at least there is an attempt to relook at education, because according to me, decoloniality is not about changing the state first. It is first about it's first of all a societal exercise which starts with both education and language policies. And if these two aspects can be addressed significantly, it's a great investment in the future, which I think is the only direction in which you can invest, because the past is gone and the present is going. There's nothing much you can do about it. So this is the only thing that I think the government can be credited with at this stage. I'm happy to be corrected either ways. If you believe I'm wrong, no problem. If you believe that I'm right and I have not presented the entire picture, I'm happy to be corrected. But apart from this, honestly speaking, I have nothing else to, because I'm not going to look at the political developments on 370 and everything else. They are important civilizational contributions. I have no doubts about it, and I'm very clear about my support for each of these developments. But on values, since the question is about Indic values, I'm focusing on education, and I believe that NEP is perhaps the only contribution or a significant step in this direction. I see Milin's question. I'm more than happy to answer that question, but I'm not sure it would do justice to the rest of the platform. Milind, why don't you take a look at my book where I've addressed this issue, and there are stalwarts who have addressed this even better. Maybe you read those books. I've mentioned those scholars in the book. Not that I'm someone who runs away from controversy. In fact, I hug it and embrace it. I'm only saying that perhaps there is literature that can address this question better.
Yeah.
Go through it first.
Okay, I think we can sort of close the floor, and maybe if anyone has subsequent questions, comments, you can try and get in touch with Sai over Twitter and elsewhere. And really, we had this question actually about the NEP, so I'm glad you sort of mentioned it.
Yeah.
That what is it that the NEP is trying to do. So maybe at another point we can have you with us to talk about that. So it's a great point that you made. Yeah.
Sure. Done. Happy to.
Yeah. Okay. Shivam, Khushi. Maybe we can, Sorry, we are having more questions. I'm really sorry. We're very short on time because the guest also has to go somewhere and we have a shortage in terms of, it's a limitation. But please do address these questions on another platform. Yeah.
I will. Sure.
Sorry, Rishabh. I'm really sorry. We are really running out of time. Very valid questions, I'm sure. Please, maybe at some other point.
Yeah, I think we can now close the question and answer segment for this talk. So we would like to thank Mr. Jay Sai Deepak for speaking and taking out time from his very busy schedule. And so we really had a really insightful session, and all of us really benefited from hearing you speak. And we really wish you all the best for your book and for your upcoming projects.
Thank you.
Now we would like to request Dr. Sabharwal to formally close the session and give the final vote of thanks.
Before Dr. Sabharwal proceeds to close the session, I think you got the best of me because you got to hear me without seeing me. So please go on.
Please, don't shortchange yourself so much.
Okay, on behalf of Delhi College of Arts and Commerce and the Department of Journalism and the students and the faculty, I thank Mr. Jay Sai Deepak, for speaking and giving us insights on coloniality, civilization, and constitution. And I'm sure there are some unanswered questions, and we would wish to invite you once again. It seems, as if we have not got a complete, input from your end. There are many questions, and I hope you'll be able to spare time. Thank you so much for actually, coming on this platform. I thank Akriti Kohli for having invited you, and we have really, gained so much from this session. Thank you for this enriching lecture, Mr. Sai Deepak.
Thank you, ma'am. I think it was a pleasure at my end as well. And I'm grateful to Ms. Kohli for giving me an opportunity to interact with such brilliant students. And I wish I had more time, because I think I was just getting into my flow, and that's when the time ended. And hopefully, maybe in a future session where we have, let's say, a deeper conversation about the NEP and other issues, I'd be more than happy to contribute whatever little I know. I had a fantastic time. I really enjoyed the session. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Namaste.
Oops.
Thanks. Okay, ma'am. So we can.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for participating.
Thank you, ma'am.